It's truly an honor and a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about what drives my research and why it's important. My key message today is that businesses are facing unprecedented challenges related to resource use, and conventional management thinking is not adequate to address those challenges. I will talk about two key capabilities for businesses to transition towards more sustainable resource use. Since the start of my research career, I've been driven by questions around the sustainability of businesses, especially around environmental issues. If you look at what's been happening in the past few years, it feels like sustainability has been taking almost a backseat compared to other business trends. Heightened geopolitical conflicts seem to be dominating the risk landscape, while new business opportunities seem to be emerging around artificial intelligence. But if you take a deeper look, the story is that sustainability challenges are interlinked with these broader business trends. They're becoming ever deeper, and they're driven to a large degree by the way that we utilize our natural resources. We've already heard about energy and water today, so I'm going to continue on that. Let's take the example of what's happening today with the Iran war. We're currently going through the worst energy crisis in modern history due to our continued dependence on fossil fuels as a resource, despite the knowledge that we should be drastically reducing their use. We've also seen another key resource, fresh water, emerge as a key factor in this conflict. One of the catalysts for the war was a water crisis in Tehran, which led to societal unrest. And we've also seen water being weaponized through the threats of strikes on desalination plants in the Persian Gulf. These types of conflicts are expected to become more common in the future as the global sustainability gap widens. Scientists have been working on quantifying the planetary boundaries for close to 20 years now. During that time frame, the broad trend has been that by nearly every indicator, the trends are getting worse. Most notably, the so-called triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution are damaging our ecosystems and threatening human livelihoods. And this is to a large degree driven by our mismanagement of natural resources, which is based on extraction, depletable resources, and a linear economic model. This is not a risk of the future, but we see the very real impacts of this today, with water crisis, wildfires, and extreme weather events becoming more common year by year, and directly hurting our economy, as we see very acutely today. We know that businesses are a major contributor to sustainability crisis, especially in resource-intensive sectors. Many businesses are also highly dependent on natural resources for their survival. So for that reason, we would expect the field of management to have answers to how to utilize resources more sustainably. But there's a fundamental mismatch in the way that we usually think about resources in management and what we know about the sustainable use of natural resources. Let's look at why that is in more detail. The first challenge is that management usually focuses on strategic resources and tends to view natural resources as commodities, which are not strategic. Strategic resources are rather thought to be immaterial ones, for example, unique knowledge or a valuable brand, which is difficult for competitors to imitate. Yet businesses may still have high dependency on natural resources, even if they're not unique. Let's take the current focus on artificial intelligence as an example. When we're talking about resources that offers to businesses, we tend to think about data, models, or the capabilities to utilize these. Yet underpinning these same immaterial resources are data centers, which consume huge amounts of energy, water, and hardware. The second challenge is that conventional view of strategic resources essentially views them as something that a business should monopolize, so essentially something that is unique and not available to others. But this doesn't really work with the sustainable and equitable use of natural resources, like water, for instance. Water is an example of something that is commonly a common pool resource. These resources have the characteristics of high subtractability, meaning that whatever one actor uses is not available to others, as well as the difficulty of excluding others from using that resource. So in short, the way that we conventionally think about resources in management is in many ways incompatible with the sustainable use of natural resources. So what can we do about this? What kind of knowledge would help the field of management transition towards a better understanding about the sustainable use of natural resources? I want to highlight two streams of research in particular, which I have focused on in my own work in the recent years. Firstly, as we've already heard today, in the last decade, we've seen considerable progress from linear economic business models towards increasing circular economy thinking. Despite this progress, there are still many hurdles to overcome, as we are still operating predominantly on the lower ends of the so-called circular economy hierarchy, based on, for example, energy recovery or material recycling. What we also know from past research in environmental management and economics, for example, is that effective management of common pool resources requires collective action. Yet this type of collective action, which spans multiple diverse types of organizations, challenges the way that we think about organizing. As said, circular economy has become a massively popular concept in the last decade. In my own work, I focused on understanding how circular economy principles can be embedded in business strategies and what this type of change entails. One of the fundamental ideas behind circularity thinking is that increased sustainability requires going beyond simply energy recovery or material recycling and thinking about higher value options, for example, reuse and refurbishing, as well as utilizing renewable resources and energy, in order to maintain resources at their highest value as long as possible. One of the challenges is that this requires more systemic thinking in order to understand what is needed simply beyond new technologies or products. In our own recent work, we identified that circularity has become a hegemonic and ambiguous concept, which leads to a lack of attention on some critical aspects which might be needed to achieve circular economy. These gaps include, for example, overemphasis on business models over more systemic models like business ecosystems, as well as increasing attention on business actors over other actors, for example, public sector and NGOs who are collaborating with the businesses. Moreover, much of our circular economy knowledge is based on research done in the global north. But we also know that in circular economy, there's a great deal of activity happening, for example, in global south context, which looks quite different in nature, often based on necessity and informal relations. Yet our global supply chains span these two very different worlds. So how can we shift towards a better systemic understanding and coordination of the circular economy? In my work with my colleagues, we studied how collective polycentric forms of governance which span businesses, public sector, and NGOs can facilitate circular economy development. These governance forms are formed by circular economy participants coming together, forming joint strategies for circularity development, adjusting their activities for a more collaborative model, and also forming more enduring structures and platforms which facilitate exchange of resources. Now, this type of governance sounds feasible in global north settings, where there's a high degree of institutional development, as well as trust between actors. But one of the unique characteristics of the circular economy is that there's also a great deal of circularity activities at the end of life of resources, for example, in areas like waste collection, that is often informal in nature. And this is especially true in global south context, where, for example, waste collection activities are often driven by necessity and informal relations between actors. In an ongoing research project with my colleagues, we are exploring what happens when these global formal governance mechanisms like circularity standards are meeting these informal governance mechanisms, and what that means for the marginalized workers who are working, for example, in areas like waste collection in these global supply chains. What we also know from research is that circular economy by itself is not enough. We also need absolute reductions in resource use. The second key point for managing more sustainable resource use, which I want to highlight, relates to collective action. I want to highlight this quote here from the system scientist Peter Seng, which emphasizes that collaboration between organizations is vital for more systemic understanding and thinking. We know from extensive research, for example, from the Nobel-winning economist Elinor Ostrom, that resource users can overcome the so-called tragedy of the commons, which is at the heart of many sustainability challenges, by engaging in collective action with each other. One of the central areas of my research has been understanding how businesses, which are already complex organizations by themselves, engage in collective action with other organizations. One of my recently published articles, for example, explored how businesses and other organizations are forming around novel ecosystems which are driven around a sustainability-driven purpose, and how they're utilizing this purpose for the narratives which guide their actions and activities over time. One of the fundamental challenges we identified is when these narratives become misaligned with the collective actions which are being done together. Finally, let's turn to look at one very concrete example of resource use and what type of challenges that entails for organizing. In a large interdisciplinary project where most of my work is focused on at the moment, we are exploring the sustainable use of freshwater resources. In terms of management, we are especially interested in water stewardship, which refers to the activities which businesses engage in order to manage the sustainable long-term use of freshwater resources. For many businesses in industries like food, textiles, and electronics, for example, the challenge is not the direct water use inside their own organization, but the water use embedded in value chains. Engaging in collective action in this type of context means collaborating with the supply chain partners, but also with the local stakeholders which are part of these water systems. It also means identifying the most effective scale of collective action, which might be, for example, a particular water basin and the involved actors around that water basin. So understanding this type of inter-organizational challenges is at the frontiers of management research. Let's go back to what we discussed in the beginning. We opened by discussing resource risks, like increasing scarcity, volatility, and conflicts, and how conventional management thinking is not effective in addressing them. I've emphasized two key capabilities for businesses to navigate these risks and find new opportunities in the more sustainable use of resources. By shifting to more circular resource use, organizations can reduce their dependency on non-renewable and virgin resources, as well as increasingly volatile global supply chains. And through collective action, we can mitigate risks and conflicts related to resource use and ensure a more sustainable and equitable living on this planet. Thank you very much.